The leaders of Israel have never considered from the very beginning that their country was big enough for them. They wanted a bigger country. The U.S., I don't think the U.S. leaders care that much about how much land Israel has. What they're worried about is managing a worldwide empire.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to UUSF. Welcome to Forum. My name is Jeff Peckrell, and I am a co-chair of the Human Rights Working Group, along with Dolores Perez-Heilbrunn and Melvin Starks. And this is a project of the Human Rights Working Group. Melvin, sadly, is not with us today. He is still in the hospital. He's on Zoom, though. So hello, Melvin. I understand that he'll be moving to a rehab center soon, but he is still across the street. Anybody wants to visit him, I'm sure he'd love to see you. We have a few announcements that I have for you today. Today's speaker is Richard Becker, Regional Coordinator with the Answer Coalition, and he'll be speaking about Palestine and U.S. imperialism in the Middle East. A week from today, we will have Tim Redmond from 48 Hills. A lot of you know him. He's been a frequent speaker in here, and he'll be talking about local political issues mostly and helping us get oriented to what's important as we head into election season this fall. On May 19th, we will have a professor from San Francisco City College, Leslie Simon is her name, and she'll be speaking on the topic of domestic abuse and a very successful program that she's got there to help survivors of that cope with that important issue. And then on June 2nd, we have a professor he'll be remote from Indiana talking. His name is Ryan Thoresen, and he'll be speaking on the issue of trans rights and the wave of legislation around the country that's trying to deny those folks of their human rights. On a couple of other announcements I want to make is that many of you are aware that students who are protesting Palestine are having encampments at our local universities, USF and San Francisco State. So the students at USF need support. I'm not sure what they need exactly, but Elliot Hellman from Jewish Voice for Peace asked us to speak about that. If any of you would like to help those students, you can contact Elliot Hellman, and I can help you do that. For San Francisco State, we have someone from San Francisco State right here, Richard, and they also need support, and he can tell you what they could use. So that would be much appreciated. I also want to mention, this is an announcement that Bruce has for me. An artist in Iran has been sentenced to death for making music that has a protest message there. So that regime is sentenced Tumaj Salehi to death for that. And I'm not sure what we'd like us to do, Bruce, the message. Let me just read this. He is a heroic artist beloved by millions in Iran and worldwide because he stands up for and with the people. Yet he has been tortured while in prison for 18 months in Iran. Tumaj is hated by the misogynist mullahs because he champions the fight against the oppression of women and the forced wearing of the hijab in his art and in the streets. He was arrested for taking part in the 2022 Women, Life, and Freedom Uprising with his art and activism. Okay, I think that does it for announcements. I'd just like to state our intention in this space is to abide by the church covenant and honor all points of view, give others a chance to speak. If we ever have any contentious subjects come up, just keep that in mind, please. And yes, I think we'll now have the Ohlone recognition, and that will be done for us by Dave Heilbrunn.
We, the members of the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco, acknowledge that our community is located on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone tribes, the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that we benefit from living and working here, and we affirm their sovereign rights as First People. The Greater Bay Area is also the ancestral territory of the Miwok, Yokuts, Patwin, and other tribes. As the original stewards of this land, the indigenous peoples understood the interconnectedness of all things and maintained harmony with nature for millennia. We honor them now for their enduring commitment to our Mother Earth. Thank you.
Okay, today's speaker is Richard Becker. He is a longtime peace and anti-war activist going back decades. He's a regional organizer with the Answer Coalition, a really great organization that I respect. He has a new book, Palestine, Israel, and the U.S. Empire, which is available to purchase in the back. By the way, you can sign up for our newsletter if you're not already on it. Please feel free to do that at the table back there, and there's other literature for you there. And I'm sure you could also sign up for Answer's mailing list there. So with no further ado, I'll welcome Richard to the podium. Thank you.
You know, I just got back 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon. I have for over 3 weeks, I did presentations in 17 cities and campuses, including at the encampments at MIT in Boston and George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And it's really an amazing movement that's emerged. I think, you know, like they all are, completely unanticipated. And it's one that is now being targeted, I believe, in a very organized and coordinated way, in the same way that, and this is not conspiracy theory, the same way that the Occupy Wall Street was targeted around the country. And hopefully that there are stronger organizations, including our own, that can help understand what the government is doing, what steps they are taking. And I would like to talk more about this a little bit later. I'll talk about the book first, but I think it's very important that we talk about what is happening right at this moment. So this is the second edition of this book, Palestine, Israel, and the U.S. Empire. This time it's published by 1804 Books. I don't know if people are familiar with 1804, based in the People's Forum in New York City. And it's got an updated chronology, which is very valuable, updated endnotes, a new introduction, a new chapter that tries to cover, at least in some way, between 2009, when we published the first edition, and now an introduction prefaced by the Palestinian youth movement. And the purpose of the book then and now is really to be a resource for activists. It's not an academic book. It's written, I think it's a very well-informed book, of course, but it's not an academic book. It's short chapters. It's written in, I think, clear, understandable language for people. And many, many people have responded to the book as it's come out, both the first edition and this edition, as being exactly that, a very useful resource for understanding the real situation, the reality that behind the myths that have been perpetrated for so many decades in regard to Palestine and Israel and the relationship to the U.S. So the book, on one hand, deals with the contradictions of the movement that created the state of Israel, the Zionist movement. And the Zionist movement, we're not talking about something contrary to one of the myths that goes back thousands of years. No, it's not that. The modern Zionist, political Zionist movement came into being in the late 1800s. It had its first announcement really to the world was at the World Zionist Congress in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland. It was, on the one hand, a reaction to very real anti-Semitism in Europe, particularly in the Russian Empire, but not only that. The Russian Empire, of course, included Poland and other parts of Europe at the time, but also in the Americas. But it was from the very beginning, it was a minority movement among politically active Jewish people, most of whom wanted to fight for equality in the societies in which they lived, not to do something then, and many of them viewed the Zionist movement as a separating movement that would run contrary to that struggle for equality. And so on the one hand, it's this reaction to very real anti-Semitism. On the other hand, from the beginning, it was another Euro supremacist colonial movement. And how do we know that? Because the leaders said so, and we quote them in the book. Theodor Herzl wrote a letter in 1902, and he was the key leader at that time of the Zionist project. And he writes a letter to Cecil Rhodes, who was the architect of British colonialism in Africa, and says to him, "Why am I writing to you? This isn't about Africa, it's about the Middle East, because it's something colonial," which is a very famous phrase now. It is something colonial. So this was always the vision of that. And there was an argument over where the colony should be, but the leaders eventually separated or settled on Palestine. It had another contradiction that's very important, and that contradiction was that they had no army or navy. You can't be a colonizer without an army and a navy. No people will accept being colonized voluntarily. So all colonialism has always been of a violent character and had to have organized violence at its disposal in order, if it were to be hope to be successful. So the leaders of this movement, first Herzl, and then he was succeeded by a man named Chaim Weizmann, who would later become the first president of the state of Israel. They traveled around and met with leaders of various governments. They went to the Russian Empire, they went to the German Empire, they went to the Ottoman Empire, the French Empire, the British Empire. And the British Empire is what they really settled their focus on after a period of time. The British Empire, in the middle of World War I, in 1917, agreed really with the issuance of what is called the Balfour Declaration. How many people know what the Balfour Declaration is? A lot of people here know what it is. It's become well known. Nobody, if I'd asked that same question a year ago, not that many hands, I think, would have gone up. Or far fewer people knew what it was. But I think it's important to talk about the creation of the State of Israel as a product of the Zionist movement in the context of how the modern Middle East came to be organized. And I want to say a little about that. So World War I started in 1914. In 1915, the British government sent a man named T.E. Lawrence. A lot of people here saw the movie Lawrence Arabia, I bet. There's this romanticized version of T.E. Lawrence. And Lawrence went to the leaders of the emerging Arab national movement and made an appeal to them. The Middle East was then controlled by it was part of the Ottoman Empire. And it went to the Arab leaders, Lawrence, and promised them that if they fought the Ottoman Empire on the side of the British, because they were on opposite sides in World War I, that the British government would support an independent Arab state when it was all over with. The next year, in 1916, was the Sykes-Picot Agreement. How many people know what that is, Sykes-Picot? Sykes-Picot Agreement was the agreement that created the boundaries of the modern Middle East. And if you go, if you talk to taxi drivers in Damascus, they know what Sykes-Picot is. Everybody knows what Sykes-Picot is who pays attention at all the politics in the Middle East, because it had such a profound effect on the Middle East. So this was an agreement, a secret agreement between the British, French, Russian Empire, and also the Italy. And it was about how they would divide the Ottoman Empire up after the war. So on the one hand, they're making this promise to the Arab movement, and the Arab national movement, they did fight against the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, there was a secret agreement being drawn up whereby France would get Lebanon and Syria. France thought they were going to get northern Iraq too, but the British, their partners in crime, stabbed them in the back on that one. They did a lot of stabbing of each other in the back. So they and Britain would take over Iraq and Jordan and Palestine and tighten its hold on Egypt, which it already had large control over. So on November 2nd of 1917, the British government issued by its Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, what became known as the Balfour Declaration, promising that his, quote, His Majesty's government would support a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, not to prejudice the rights of anybody, of non-Arab people, of non-Jewish people, which was taken exception to by many Arab historians who said, look, this agreement, 92% of the population was Palestinian then, Arab. And this doesn't, the word Arab doesn't appear anywhere here, showing the colonial mentality. 5 days later was the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. And the significance of the Bolshevik Revolution was that the new government that came into being as one of its first acts published the secret Sykes-Picot Treaty. And it was a few weeks after taking power in November of 1917. So within about a month or so, people who in the Middle East found out, in the Arab world, found out, number one, that instead of independence, they were being chopped up, and the new colonizers were coming to replace the Ottoman rulers. And number two, that in the heart of the Arab world, the British government is promising a new state or a new home to a European colonial movement, another colonial movement. So when the British moved in, and the other thing that's somewhat ironic about it is the British didn't control that territory yet. It would be another almost year before they conquered Palestine. In 1920, there were rebellions that broke out against all over the Arab world, massive rebellions against the, and in some cases, armed rebellions against the British, and in Palestine against the Zionists who were beginning to come in. But it was, the point I would like to make about this and has importance to us down till today is, one, that this is how the borders of the modern Middle East came into being. They're another colonial, imperialist imposition on the people of that region. And the other is that this was the sponsor. The British government, in fact, became the sponsor for the Zionist project, without which nothing, without which they could not hope to succeed. And over the next 30 years, and skipping over a great deal, because I really want to have time for discussion, but over the next 30 years, that British decision opened the door for tens of thousands of settlers to come. So whereas they were 8%, about 8%, or even less actually, because some of the Jewish population in 1917 was indigenous population who were also against the Zionist project, very emphatically against it. But so that by 1947, when there would be the vote at the United Nations that partitioned Palestine, they constituted about 35% of the population. None of that could have happened without the British sponsorship. And there was rebellion after rebellion after rebellion that took place in Palestine between 1920 and 1939. From 1936 to 39, there was a revolution in the country, a 6-month general strike followed by 2 years of guerrilla warfare. And that was put down, which left the Palestinians in a very weakened position at the end of that revolutionary attempt, to drive out the British and to drive out the Zionists. And then, of course, comes World War II and all of what along with it. This the slaughter by the Nazis and their allies of millions and millions of Jewish people, of millions of Slavic people, trade unionists, LGBTQ people. They tried to wipe out all disabled people, but particularly in regard to the murder of 6 million Jewish people, that was murder that was carried out on an industrial scale. And there was industrial scale means you have to have industry to do it. And the main industry was railroads. So the railroads were bringing people into the concentration camps. And I think many people here know about this. And in many cases, right into the gas chambers. So there was an appeal that was made to the British and to the US leaders at that time to try to do something to slow down the rate of murder, of the industrial rate of murder, to bomb the rail lines. At least it would slow the process that was going on. And they refused to do so. They said it was not strategic to do so. And the reason I'm saying this is that there would be in the aftermath of World War II the pretense or the lie that somehow there was great sympathy, and this is what caused U.S. support for the creation of the State of Israel, was out of sympathy for Jewish people. In fact, before the war started in Europe, many of the leading families in the U.S. ruling class supported Nazism. This was the Kennedy family, the Bushes, the Fords, and more. They had not been sympathetic. They had defeated attempts. The powers that be had defeated the attempts to allow 20,000 Jewish children to come into the U.S. as refugees in 1940. But now, when the war was over, and after a lot of dispute within, there was a decision made in Washington to support the creation of the Israeli state, the partition plan and November 29th, 1947, was the vote at the UN to partition Palestine, 55% to be a Zionist state, 44% to be a Palestinian state, 1% to be an international zone around Jerusalem. After that, the British withdrew, and it wasn't the U.S. that immediately came in to provide what the State of Israel needed, particularly in regard to war and military equipment. It was France, and France came in, and from the 50s into the early 60s, France was the main sponsor, became the main international sponsor, and provided not only warplanes and all kinds of equipment, but the atomic bomb. That's how Israel got the atomic bomb that was provided to them by French technicians and scientists who provided them with the technology and the means by which to. And that's how Israel, at its Dimona plant, developed nuclear weapons. So we went from Britain to France as the sponsoring, the dominant power. And my view about this is that without that sponsor, right down to today, the State of Israel could not exist. And the new sponsor, the one that is the current sponsor up until today, started after the 1967 war and the conquest of the West Bank, Gaza, the entire Sinai Peninsula was conquered, and the Golan Heights and East Jerusalem. So it was after that that the U.S. looked at it, and as a quote, Gerald Ford, who was then the House Minority Leader, said, Israel has done a great job for us in the middle, and by that war, by smashing the militaries of Egypt and Syria and Jordan. The next year, Nixon was elected, and Nixon was a virulent anti-Semite, as many people may know. But it was under Nixon that the Nixon Doctrine came into being. And the Nixon Doctrine is when, under Nixon is when the millions of dollars that were going, or hundreds of millions of dollars that were going to Israel, turned into billions of dollars that were going to Israel, to the State of Israel. And so from that time to the present time, and of course I'm skipping over much, but from that time to the present time, it has been Israel that has been that indispensable sponsor or supporter among the big powers. So this is one thing that I think is important in terms of continuity, is that the Zionist project could not have succeeded without the sponsorship of one of the big powers, and it could not continue to succeed without the sponsorship and the support of the United States today. One other thing I want to say about the myths and realities is that in 1947, when the UN resolution happened, and the UN resolution had to get 2/3 to pass, it only passed because the U.S. put immense pressure on its neo-colonies of Haiti, Philippines, Liberia, and Thailand. That put it over. They were all going to vote no, and the U.S. forced them to vote yes. And two of the ambassadors actually resigned rather than vote yes. But that's how that petition was petition resolution was passed. But also, we should think about what the world was like in 1947. Rather than colonization coming to being, decolonization was on the order of the day. Decolonization meant that much of the world was still in colonies. So almost all of Africa was still colonies. Much of Asia was still colonies. They didn't have seats at the United Nations. A large part of humanity didn't vote, weren't able to vote or were not represented by those who could vote at the UN. So this was the war broke out in 1947-48. The war broke out immediately after the UN resolution. The Palestinian side was very weakened by what I mentioned, their defeat in 1939 and the revolution of that time, which had left them in a somewhat decimated state. And all kinds of laws, like 10 years in prison for owning a knife and 10 days in prison for owning a stick. There were all these regulations. And so the fighting went on, and the Zionist side, which was much better armed and organized and funded, a lot of support from outside, would win most of the battles. But in winning those battles, they were not succeeding from their point of view. And this relates to another one of the continuities, I think, up till today, that they were not succeeding in evicting the population. And how did they change that? Well, they came up with a new plan, which we document in the book, Plan Dalet. Dalet is the fourth letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And Plan Dalet was a plan for terrorism against the Palestinian population. It was announced to the world, and the world found out about it because there was one reporter there from a French news agency, the massacre at Deir Yassin, a small village outside of Jerusalem, where virtually the whole population was killed on April 9th of 1948. And there were continued to be many massacres that followed from that. But so the war changed. In the early stage, the Palestinian population, in a village or a couple of villages that were near a battle, they would just retreat to another village. The point of this new strategy was to get them to leave the country, to leave Palestine. And the way that was accomplished was by going into villages, separating men and boys of fighting age, as they put it, shooting some, maybe shooting many, loading the survivors into trucks at the beginning and driving them to borders and forcing them out, the borders of Lebanon or Syria or Jordan or Egypt. And this was done repeatedly, enough so that the population just had to hear rumors that this was about to happen or the battle was approaching to flee. And by that process, 750,000 to 800,000 Palestinians were forced out. There had been about 570,000 Palestinians in the part of the partition plan that was supposed to become the state of Israel. And the Israeli leaders made it very clear, and had made it very clear for a long time, and again, we include this in the book, that their intention was not just to settle in Palestine, but to have an exclusive country, to create a country that was free of Palestinians. And so this was the strategy. You know, there was a myth that the Arab rulers and neighboring countries had told the Palestinians to leave and they could return with the Arab armies. This is a complete fabrication. And most of the Palestinians were farmers. You can't just leave your farm. You can't leave your farm. And that's why farming is so hard. You have to keep doing it all the time, of day after day after day. So the idea that they would have left for any other reason than being compelled to by the threat of death, no, they could not have been compelled to. And this is an important continuity, I think, till today, is that an objective perspective of what is going on in Gaza right now, what the Israelis are doing in Gaza, what they're hoping for is to take back the land. And they're intending, and many in the government are already implementing it, to take back the West Bank. So the exclusivist aspect of Zionism has continued as well. So the other thing I want to mention, two other things. One is, why does the U.S. give such huge support to the state of Israel? I mean, here's a country that just got an extra 26 billion on top of 4 billion a year, and maybe a lot more than that. We don't really know. And some people think, well, it's the power of the Israeli lobby. And I don't underestimate that the Israeli lobby has influence. I mean, and I don't underestimate in any way the proclivity of our great representatives in Congress to go wherever money is offered to them and do whatever money. But I think there's something more important than that, and that is that, and we document this in the book as well, is that Israel is really a part, from the point of view of Washington. This has nothing to do with, some kind of, pretend shared values or something like that. It has everything to do with empire. Israel is a small country, relatively speaking. Palestine is a relatively small area. But Israel is a very large military base of the U.S. and a very key strategic region. And you can see that they do things that the U.S. wants done and they want done, like the bombing in Syria that seems to go on every other day. And they really act as a security agent for U.S. interests in the region. And right now, the main focus of U.S. foreign policy is shifting from West Asia to East Asia, the pivot to Asia. But West Asia, the Middle East, North Africa remains very important to the U.S. And Israel's role in patrolling, controlling that region has great importance. And in fact, it may have increasing importance. The U.S. and Israel do not have an identity of viewpoints about what their priorities are. Israel's main priority is more land. And this is another thing, without going into it, that we document in the book about the war after war after war, the war of 1948-49, and then the war of 1956, the attack on Egypt that happened, the 1967 war, the 1978 invasion of Lebanon, the 1982 invasion of Lebanon, and over again, the attacks on Gaza, the constant terrorizing of the Palestinian population in the West Bank. These are all aimed at increasing the land size, the area. The leaders of Israel have never considered from the very beginning that their country was big enough for them. They wanted a bigger country. The U.S., I don't think the U.S. leaders care that much about how much land Israel has. What they're worried about is managing a worldwide empire. They have 800 military bases around the world. I mean, we say that often, but it's really an astounding figure. Who has ever had such, this is an empire that surpasses really the British Empire, which they said the sun never set on. So they have contradictions in that, and the contradiction now between the U.S. and Israel, aside from all the things that they have in common, but is that what the Israelis are doing is angering a lot of people who are inside the U.S. empire or attached to the U.S. empire, and it's causing problems for them, and particularly in the Middle East. And the thing about Israel that makes it different is you can have the Saudi Arabia or Bahrain or the United Arab Emirates, and they can sign agreements with Israel, the Abraham Accords. Saudi Arabia hasn't signed it yet, but some of these family monarchies, and parenthetically, you might ask, why are there still family monarchies? But they have signed these agreements with Israel and with Washington. But if the people of Bahrain, where the U.S. Fifth Fleet is based, if the people in Bahrain had their way, they would overthrow their government and cancel that agreement with Israel. So from Washington's point of view, that means they're not really stable. these reactionary governments preside over populations that do not support them and would like to see them gone. And that's different than Israel. So no matter how much they swear the leaders want to swear their allegiance to the U.S. and their agreement with the U.S., from Washington's point of view, they're not really stable in the way that Israel is seen as being a stable military asset. So I just want to say that this about the current situation. First of all, this situation where this new movement has emerged in the United States would not have happened except for, first and foremost, the steadfastness of the Palestinian people in the struggle and refusing, those who are there and refusing to leave. The struggle against great odds. I mean, they're not just facing the Israeli military, they're facing the Israeli military backed by the United States, and in coordination with them are these reactionary Arab governments, which also fear the Palestinians. So the fact that the Palestinian movement has continued, despite being counted out all these times in 1948 and 1967 and 1970 and 1982, over and over and over again, it's really an amazing thing that today, in 2024, Israel is at the center of world politics. I mean, it's the main story right now. And that could not have taken place without the resistance, the Palestinian resistance movement. But in addition to that, and inspired by the resistance, there is a worldwide movement that has also come into being, including here. And I think we've all seen it. How many people have been to a protest or an activity? So these have been taking place with astounding regularity, I mean, over and over and over again. How many demonstrations have there been since last October, just in the Bay Area? And then we've seen the emergence of this new student movement, which is really something. I don't know how many, I don't think we have a way to know. I don't think we ever knew how many cities and towns had demonstrations during the Vietnam War. I don't think we've ever really known the total number. And I don't think the mass media is going out of its way, the corporate media is going to go out of its way to let us know now, because they don't want to encourage the movement. But it's amazing what's happened. And now there's an ideological and physical attack that's taking place on this movement. And the ideological aspect of it is, one, the false charges of anti-Semitism, where every action, the Defamation League, and I think we should take away the A. They shouldn't be called, they're just the Defamation League, designed to defame anyone who criticizes the state of Israel. And the AIPAC and the Canary Mission and these other organizations, they in their listing of anti-Semitic, they list every pro-Palestinian activity as another anti-Semitic act. So there's this, and then there's the outside agitators. The outside agitators. I mean, Wolf Blitzer and Anderson Vanderbilt Cooper and the others on stage, they're talking about outside agitators. I mean, that's the language of Bull Connor and George Wallace, with the idea that when the first time around was that Black people were all happy in the South until these people showed up from the North and told them things were bad. And then they got excited and, I mean, it's outrageous that they would use this terminology. I mean, it would be one thing, not acceptable, but if they said people who aren't students are protesting as well on campus and supported them. But no, it's like the students didn't know until the outside agitators showed up to do this. So it's really an outrage. And it should be viewed as really an outrage. And then there's those elements, I think, that are supposed to soften up the population. They talk about anti-Semitism and they talk about outside agitators. But then you have the physical side of it, which is like what happened at UCLA. At UCLA, there was nothing that could be called violent about the encampment. It was attacked by these fascists. And we need to find out who exactly they are, who carried out this attack, because it wasn't some spontaneous thing. It went on for 7 hours, the attack. A lot of people were injured. The police stood by. The campus security fled into a building and locked the doors. But then the quote unquote violence became the pretext for the police to move in and smash the encampment and tear it down. But whose violence was it? It wasn't the violence of the protesters. It was the violence of the fascists who carried out this attack. We should remember that the so-called Jewish Defense League in the 1980s murdered the head of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee in Los Angeles, bombed him, bombed his house, and killed him. Are there elements of that still around? I would guess that there are, but that's a tactic of carrying out the violence against the protests and then using that attack as a pretext for shutting them down, for tearing them down and arresting people. And also, there's been a lot of police brutality. I was in New Orleans, and actually where was it? In New Orleans, where a student who went to Virginia Tech, and we never heard anything about this one. The police arrested 100 people at Virginia Tech, rounded them up, and kept them on buses overnight without food or water or access to bathrooms or anything like that. And that one I haven't seen anywhere in the media at all. So there's kind of like really brutal attacks that are taking place, and the mass arrests now total more than 2,500. And another thing about this I should say is about the accusation of anti-Semitism. In actuality, many Jewish people, and particularly young Jewish people, are in the demonstrations and are being beaten by the police. So isn't it the police who are anti-Semitic? I mean, in terms of attacking the Jewish students and Jewish youth, as well as Palestinian students and youth, and people of all nationalities who are being attacked. But this is the part of the war that's going on. And so I think that the bottom line for us right now is to do everything that we can to continue this movement and continue this struggle. And that means, I think, giving support to the colleges and the universities, where everybody coming out means something at this point. This is a real battle. They want to take down this movement the way that they dissembled the Occupy Wall Street, and where there were 100 cities that had encampments or something like that at the peak of Occupy Wall Street. Maybe many more than that. And so we need to be prepared from both a legal point of view, from a mobilizing point of view, from a point of view of refuting the false propaganda that is being fed to the people every day, to support what is really an attempt to destroy an extremely promising, radical new movement. Thank you.
I'm going to read a few questions that people in the audience have jotted down on the note cards. And if you have others, please use the cards and we'll ask them here. Please say something about the 10,000 Palestinian prisoners / hostages, US 130, there are around 130 Israeli hostages, sadly, being held by Hamas. Those whom Israel has not killed with the bombings. I think that's what that means.
Yeah. So, among the 10,000 approximate, and the number goes up every day right now, Palestinian prisoners, around 4,000 of them are being held in administrative detention. Administrative detention means that you are arrested, there's no charges, you're taken into custody. That can be for 6 months. and it is renewable without limit. So 4,000 people have been, and most of those are in the West Bank. Almost all of them are in the West Bank who have been taken in. And so I think that if people are held without charges, they have been kidnapped from a legal point of view, and they are in fact hostages. Of course, this is part of the vocabulary war that goes on with every news broadcast, about what you can say, who's brutal, who's not brutal, I mean, all of that kind of thing. But there's a particular thing about the prisoners that's very important, is that prisoners have very high status in Palestinian society. These are political prisoners, and they are looked upon. They meet together, the different factions, as they're called, or parties, and they have a lot of influence, and what they say has a lot of influence. And what the National Security Minister of Israel, as he's called, Itamar Ben-Gvir, he's a fascist. I'm not using hyperbole. He is a fascist, and he is now in charge of the prisons. So they're doing all these things to make life unbearable for the prisoners. I mean, really horrific kind of stuff is going on, and I bet we only know a tiny fraction of what's happening.
Did a prominent doctor die in the prison this week? Was that in the news I read?
There was a prominent doctor, and there was also a very long time prisoner who had been on a very long hunger strike who died recently.
I think he was taken hostage at Al-Shifa Hospital. Here's a question. My understanding is Martin Luther King was uniformly denounced by the U.S. media when he started speaking out against the Vietnam War, the famous Riverside church speech, right? Do you see parallels in the media response to student protests for Palestinian rights and protests against the Vietnam War?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. There was not one newspaper in the United States, I believe, one major newspaper that did not condemn Martin Luther King for his speech at Riverside Church on April 4th, 1967, denouncing the Vietnam War. It's a very eloquent, an important speech. I don't agree with everything in it, but it's such an important speech. And he was condemned a year later on the same day, April 4th, 1968. Of course, he was assassinated.
This is a comment. Aren't Palestinians Semitic? I'd like to add a question on that, which is, why isn't the term anti-Palestinianism more of a thing? Because I think that is what we see a lot of the time. Not to deny at all the fact that there is real anti-Semitism, but there is a lot of anti-Palestinian. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Do you want to repeat that? Or
the question was, aren't Palestinians Semitic? It's a statement that someone wrote on a card. Any comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really important to note that up until now, I don't think, because I think we would see it over and over and over again, as I haven't seen any physical attacks attributed to protesters on Jewish people, Jewish students. And maybe other people have, but I haven't seen anything like that that's going on. And so this is more of like they can't say Palestinian. They can't really say in the media coverage any of the reality of what's going on, including that Palestinians are a Semitic people.
Some people, myself included, think that the people of Palestine and Israel are, in a sense, trapped between two reactionary forces, the Zionist fascists and the theocrats like those in Hamas and in Iran. Do you foresee the emergence of a real liberating force that could forge a kind of society that could be just for Jews and Palestinians together?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a socialist, so I don't have the same viewpoint as Hamas, but Hamas has to be, I think, has to be seen as a resistance organization fundamentally, along with the Popular Front, the Democratic Front, the Popular Resistance Forces, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They're all part of the resistance. And so I think that equating them with the colonizer, they're the colonized people. They're the colonized and oppressed people. in the situation that exists. So I would not want to make an equation.
Did I hear right that Nixon was an anti-Semite, yet the U.S. support for Israel and Zionism increased substantially under him? This seems contradictory.
Well, I think Nixon would, get drunk and he would force Henry Kissinger to I think Kissinger is the one who talks about this, is that or somebody in the inner circle, he'd point at leaders of the anti-war movement and say, isn't that one Jewish? And isn't that one Jewish? He was like really very virulent anti-Semite. The Nixon doctrine was the idea that Iran, where the U.S. had put the Shah on the throne 15 years earlier and ushering in a quarter century of brutal police dictatorship, and Israel at the other end, kind of the other end of the Middle East, that they should be the poles around which U.S. security, the protection of U.S. security interests, should be provided. And the reason for that, particularly at that time, was there were 550,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. The U.S. was a little. I think others here will remember, as I do, that in 1972, part of McGovern's running for president was the idea that Vietnam is the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time. And everybody knew what that meant, the Middle East at that time. So this was a way to deal with the fact that the U.S. empire was overstretched because of Vietnam. And so that the Nixon doctrine was meant to deal with that issue.
Do you worry about jihadist organizations like Hamas having control in the Middle East?
Well, I think that there are organizations. I think it would be very, very wrong. And as I said, I don't have complete political agreement or political agreement in the terms of the program of Hamas, but it would be. I think there's another attempt to confuse people by suggesting that they're somehow like ISIS. They're not like ISIS, and they're not like Al Qaeda in terms of their extraordinarily reactionary those kind of policies.
And in public universities where divestment is not relevant, I don't know if that's true actually. What are meaningful requests to leverage change in U.S. foreign policy, other than the very power of the protests and encampments?
Well, one of the places I spoke was in New Paltz, SUNY New Paltz, State University in New York there. And they were demanding that in that particular campus, that they should, the university should stop buying things, contracting with corporations that have interest in selling arms or whatever to the state of Israel. So that's part of divestment.
Could you comment on the Stand Together movement in Israel, Palestine, that is making appearances here in the Bay Area?
Stand Together, is it pro-Israeli movement?
I actually don't know of it.
Is what?
It's Palestinians and Jews together in Israel who are demanding a different kind of side for respect all the.
Oh, okay. There what?
They were here in the area. We were very well received.
Oh,
In some of the synagogues.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a very big division in the Jewish community now over what Israel is doing. So I'm glad to hear, that they were well received. There needs to be kind of a breakaway, though, really, this whole movement that's gone on for how long is it? A year and a half now, since the extreme right-wing government with fascist ministers came in. But that movement in Israel, which wants to bring down Netanyahu, has kept the Palestinian issue out, and that's a very large part of the population.
This question's a little hard for me to read, so if I don't get this right, please help me out. But it says, For any who fear for their survival, I think it's talking about Jewish people rightly feared for their survival in the period of the Holocaust. What is the alternative to the state of Israel?
Well, I think that, we have to fight. I mean, how many Jewish people are there in the United States right now? I'm not really sure, but several million, at least. We have to fight against real anti-Semitism, and there's enough real anti-Semitism without making these false accusations about what the student movement is doing or the pro-Palestinian movement. So people aren't going to leave. They're not going to leave. Everyone's going to leave. They're not going to leave France, and, they're not going to leave England for the most part. So in other words, if we're talking about protecting people's safety, then we have to fight against racism, discrimination, bigotry everywhere. And I think the deal with Israel is an apartheid state. We document in the book, there's now many organizations, Israeli, Palestinian, international, US, at least 20 have done, South African, at least 20 major human rights organizations have done extensive reports on how the many different ways that Israel is an apartheid state. And the reason I'm saying this is that to say that that state should continue, it's really, like saying apartheid South Africa was good because it was good for white people or something. I mean, it's not exactly the same situation, because there has been very real anti-Semitism, but it has to be fought against wherever it is. And the idea that you would defend an apartheid state continuing with its system is completely unacceptable. And our great Congress, again, they voted back in October 412-9 that Israel isn't an apartheid state. I mean, like that, you can vote that the sun goes around the earth, but I mean, it's really amazing that, I mean, if you only knew this one thing, if you knew that in the West Bank, the settlers are governed under Israeli civil and criminal law. The Palestinians who live in the West Bank are governed on emergency military regulations that were taken almost directly from what the British colonial military regulations were. Your chance of winning in court, 99.7% of all Palestinian cases, they're found guilty. And they don't have to tell you the evidence. You can say, for state reasons, we're not telling you or your attorney so, I mean, a lot of times now when Palestinians are arrested and they go in the court, they turn their back on the judge, because it's just like, we don't accept that this is legitimate, that we're being subjected to. And no one should think that the state of Israel can continue as an apartheid state and that somehow is justifiable in any way.
So we have one more question that's kind of historical, and then several that relate to looking forward in the upcoming elections here in this country. Someone asked, did Yasser Arafat back away from the two-state agreement? Could we just recap like what Fatah and PLO's evolution of doctrine was, and also Hamas, which I think this week said that they would accept a two-state solution as a condition for a ceasefire?
Yeah.
They said they would lay down their arms if there was a two-state solution.
The whole Palestinian independent movement that exists, that really developed after the 1967 war, at the beginning was all insisted on one state. And then in 1974, there was a split, and the Fatah, which was headed by Yasser Arafat, and the Democratic Front adopted a two-state solution. The Popular Front rejected that idea. But what all of them have said in different ways, and including in there's an interview as an appendix to our book by Ahmed Sadat, who was this is back from 2008, who was the leader of the Popular Front, was that they would accept a two-state as a step toward full liberation. The Hamas has said a number of years ago that they would accept a hudna, as they call it, meaning a ceasefire for 50 years. And now, as you say, Hamas has, or whoever asked the question, that Hamas has said that they would accept that as a part of a ceasefire agreement. So I don't think that any of them regard this as you know, this could be the end of the struggle. But you know, there's so much of this objection to the slogan "from the river to the sea," you know, from the mainstream media and so on. But that's exactly what Israel is doing. Is doing, in fact, on the ground, seeking to be from the river to the sea, and to get rid of the rest of the Palestinian population.
I think Jared Kushner was quoted as gloating over the possibility of developing the real estate in Gaza.
Yeah, waterfront. He said it would make a great waterfront area.
Is the government of Israel actively involved in that initiative, or is that just loose talk?
Oh, it's not loose talk. We shouldn't. The person who's the Minister of Finance now, so people don't think I'm throwing the word fascist around loosely. He said a year and a half ago, and this is Smotrich, who also has a portfolio dealing with the West Bank, that he said, "I am a fascist homophobe." He said it on media. And Ben Gvir, who has an even more powerful position. Both of these are, by the way, leaders of the fascist settler movement that goes around burning Palestinians' houses, cars, chanting death to the Arabs. I mean, anybody who's chanting death to the Arabs, I think we can consider them to be a fascist. You know, so those people who are in the government, in powerful positions in the government, and who can bring down the government on any day, given there's 64 to 56 seats on Netanyahu has 64 seats in his coalition, 56 seats on the other side. If either of those parties or both of them withdraw from the government falls. So they have this tremendous influence there. The movement, the settler movement that they lead different factions of, has already evicted about 30 villages in the West Bank, has evicted the population by carrying out violence against them and then telling them we'll be back and we'll carry out more violence against you. That's what they intend. They have threatened that if there is a ceasefire agreement, Ben Gvir and Smotrich have threatened that if there is a ceasefire agreement, they'll withdraw from the government and bring the government down. So, and Netanyahu himself doesn't want a ceasefire, doesn't want negotiations. What they want is land. They are land hungry, and they've been land hungry from the beginning.
Please talk about the potential effects of the current crisis on the upcoming U.S. elections.
Well, it appears that it's going to have a very big impact. I think that Biden thought that, you know, on October 7th, that he, by showing 100% support for and pouring weaponry and all that in to Israel, that it would wrap up the election for him. Instead, it's done the opposite. It's put his election prospects in real question. And what's going to, you know, how things will unfold over the next 6 months until the election actually takes place, it's hard to say. We can be pretty sure there's going to be a huge campaign to say we have to support Biden because Trump's even worse. I think it's very, you know, the people who are managing the foreign policy of the United States right now, and that's Jake Sullivan. I don't think Biden's doing that much managing. I think he's doing more signing off on things, you know, but he's part of the crew. But Sullivan, who's the National Security Advisor, Blinken, who's the Secretary of State, Campbell, who's in charge of China policy, Victoria Nuland, who has been in charge of Ukraine policy. They all came up under Hillary Clinton. They all came to prominence when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. They moved up to higher positions, and then Trump was, you know, and then they continued when Kerry was Secretary of State. And then they were all out. Well, Trump was in for one term, and then they're all back. But now they're back as the top people who are managing U.S. foreign policy. And they are neocons. They are neocons who have a ruthless view of maintaining U.S. global supremacy. So who's better and who's worse, you know, you can make that argument on both sides.
Do you have any fear that the current protest movement could cost Biden the election?
Ditto. Ditto to what I just said. You know, I don't know. I mean, I'm voting for Claudia de la Cruz, who's the candidate of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, because I think it's actually more important in this election that there be a big turnout of people who are independent of both the Democrats and the Republicans. This is not going to change until there's a big change, until there's, you know, the development of a people's movement in the millions. And I think whatever will facilitate that, that's what we should think about. Because as I said, with the last question, I think you can make a pretty strong argument. I mean, Trump is horrific. Trump is horrible. But, you know, if you are living under the bombs in Gaza, Biden is just as horrible.
Why doesn't Hamas just surrender?
Why doesn't Hamas just surrender? Well, they're in the lead of a movement. They're in the lead of the resistance. They're not the only force in the resistance by any means. There's a lot of forces that I mentioned before that are part of it. But you know, I think that they've shown that they'd rather die than surrender. Because if they surrender, that's, you know, that's it for the Palestinians.
Please speak to the term of Israeli settlers in the West Bank. They have been occupiers for many years. Why do we call them settlers, I guess is the question. Modern cities connected by freeways that are only for use by Jews. I could add Palestinians in poor, widely separated areas, sometimes called Bantustans.
Yeah, I mean, it's like really shocking. How many people have been there?
I have been
there. You've seen the conditions in the West Bank, and I mean in all the occupied areas. I mean, it's truly it's just incredible. I mean, it's so incredible. Like when you see the settlements, whatever you want to call them, colonies. They're up on the hills. They're on the top of the hills. They have adequate water to not only water their lawns, but fill their swimming pools. And then if you go down in the villages below, there's a shortage of water. There's not a great deal of water there. And so everything is for them. The roads are for them. You know, I quote in the book the former education minister of Israel, who was a liberal, and she described way, this is like in the early 2000s, that she's driving down a road and and she sees that a cop has pulled over a Palestinian driver, and they have different color license plates, so you can tell them apart. It's pulled him over, and she stops, and you know, she asks, "Why are you arresting this person?" She said, "Because it's a Jewish-only road." And she says, "Well, where are the signs that say it's a Jewish-only road?" And he said, "What do you want? What do you want us to do? Put up signs so that in the West they can call us an apartheid government?" Yeah, I mean, right.
You have to have a license plate that is only available to you if you're a settler, is how it really works, right?
I believe that it is. I know they're different, but I don't know if they have the same ones as the population inside Israel or not.
What is your vision for the Middle East if you could make it happen, or if it evolved to a point? I'm not sure about the last part of the question, but what is your vision for the Middle East? Middle East.
I mean, it's my vision for anywhere is that I think that I think capitalism is killing us. I think there has to be a new system. It needs to be a socialist system. It needs to start, above all, it needs to start here because, you know, the capitalism and militarism are devouring society's resources and everything that's needed in such a way that it really can threaten the future of humanity and life. And, I mean, when they talk about there's a huge military buildup going on now that we don't hardly ever see in regard to China. And what would a war with China mean? I mean, maybe the U.S. policymakers are thinking they can have a conventional war and they can force China to back down, and but it also has real possibilities of nuclear war, and what that means for the future of humanity, and the corporate profiteering, the corporate, just like the incredible drive for profit at the expense of everything. So I think that in terms of what's the future for us, what's the future for the Middle East, what's the future for the world, the future is not very promising, to put it mildly, as long as the capitalist system continues.
We're going to wrap up Q&A in just a minute or two here. Rhetorical, perhaps, but why should the U.S. support any country that seeks to be a single religion or ideology, such as Israel? Isn't this anti-U.S. Constitution?
Well, I don't think the U.S. cares about the religion of anybody. I mean, I don't think that's their concern. I mean, they'll use religious pretexts to for propaganda or something like that, but that's not really what they're interested in. They're not interested in the welfare of anybody, of any people except themselves. They pretend to be friends of the state of Israel because they're friends of Jewish people, which they're not. And if what I'm saying is accurate, that they're giving billions of dollars to Israel to protect its interests in the Middle East, that's not a relationship of friend to friend. That's a relationship of the client to their security guard. So that's all. Anytime they start talking about that, should, like they say, reach for your wallet or something like that. Anytime they pretend to be concerned about women's rights. That was the big thing when the Afghanistan war started, was that suddenly Laura Bush appears in the media. I mean, she hadn't appeared at all. And suddenly she's there to talk about fighting for women's rights in Afghanistan by bombing them.
Richard, we have some questions here in chat for you. Somebody writes, I want to help. What can I do?
Well, I think that people right now need to participate in the actions that are going on, particularly go to the campuses, be what they call an outside agitator. You won't be an outside agitator. You'll be a supporter. You'll be there in solidarity. But we should do that. The more that we do, the more support that we can give. And I think that, people will think, well, the students only want to see students. That's not true either. I think that they very much welcome support from older people. So I think that people need to, wherever there are actions that are taking place, join them. This is a big battle. This is a big battle that's going on with high stakes.
We have another question here. How is the taking of land by newcomers, such as settlers to the West Bank, any different from the taking of this continent by settlers from the native nations?
Yeah, well, it's not fundamentally any different. It's land theft, and it's based on racism. It's based on the idea that that you don't have to respect the rights of indigenous people, and you can just take their land, and that's been the idea of every conquering power.
Okay, this is probably a good place to wrap up. But we have to make it quick. You have a question? Is this right? You're raising your hand over there.
A microphone to you if you would like.
Thank you, Mr. Becker, for your outstanding presentation. The information you share with all of us here is stuff that most Americans are not even aware of. May I just make several quick points from your presentation? You mentioned, for example, that one of the commendable things about the Palestinians in their current state is that they're staying put. And my only response, I understood what you meant, sir, but I just want to make a parenthetical comment to say that they're staying put because they have nowhere else to go. That is their land. Another thing I want to mention is on the night that the police entered the building at Columbia University, the MSNBC woman reporter of all networks was kept excitedly saying over and over again that it's the agitators who are causing all of this, the agitators.
Yeah.
And of all networks, that was on MSNBC, which is usually liberal. You also mentioned in your early part of your presentation, sir, about the agreement that the colonial powers agreed to regarding the Middle East. It reminded me as a Vietnamese human being that exactly the same kind of thing occurred at the end of the Indochina War in 1954, where the powers that came to the so-called Geneva Accords were the superpowers, including France, the colonial power which killed millions and millions of Vietnamese human beings, my own people. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, a lot of the Palestinians could leave, but many are determined not to. There's a lot of fluidity in the area, but I appreciate your point, and I especially appreciate your point about Vietnam. I mean, as Eisenhower said back in at the time of Geneva, that if the people could vote, 80% of them would have voted for Ho Chi Minh. That was his opinion. So they had to prevent the election, and they did. And because they did, you have like the horrific war that took, as you said, the lives of millions of Vietnamese people. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I think we'll wrap up now.
You can get the book.
Yes, please see the book on the table back here. I'm going to invite someone up to give an announcement about a PG&E event that's about to happen. But also come back next Sunday. We'll have someone speaking from 48 Hills, Tim Redmond, sorry, will be coming to talk about the current state of affairs here in this city. Come back next Sunday, please.
Hello, my name is Sean. I'm an organizer with the People's Takeover of PG&E. I work with Richard. And Richard, thank you for speaking to Israel's apartheid over Palestine. I also will mention that speaking to the apartheid of Palestine from Israel, they controlled all aspects of their life, including utilities such as water, gas, and electricity. Palestinians were forced to purchase these resources from Israel at outrageous prices just to have access to their basic human rights. In some of the poorest communities, water expenses alone could be half of a family's monthly income. Often they would face power outages, freezing temperatures, or be left with no access to clean water, despite these resources being readily available. We can easily see this for the brutal, inhumane tactic that it clearly is. This is the tactic of an imperialist capitalist state. Palestine's liberation is tied to the liberation of people everywhere, because understanding the tactics used to maintain apartheid help us to understand what they can and will use against us, the working class people, in our own cities. In the Bay, PG&E has completely monopolized our heating and energy. We are forced to pay whatever they demand, and if we want to power our houses or not freeze in the cold winter nights, we simply have no other choice. During the last 5 years, PG&E has set at least 31 wildfires, burned nearly 1.5 million acres, burned 23,000 structures, and killed over 113 Californians. During those same 5 years of failure, PG&E doubled the cost of utilities, and in the last 5 months alone has increased rates by over 18%. There is no sign of the rate hike stopping, and it is time we say no more. This is an intolerable burden on the working class, and while some of us can meet these demands, others have to choose between food and energy. PG&E has destroyed our communities, destroyed the environment, and destroyed lives, all while we pay for it. While PG&E kills, we pay their bills. We will be holding a public forum on May 10th to discuss the path towards taking down PG&E and establishing a public utility in the state of California. It will be held at the Unite Here Hall at 7 p.m. We need your help to stop the commodification of utilities, as there should not be a paywall on our basic needs. After the service, you can talk to the organizers at the social justice table to sign a petition and learn more about our campaign. Thank you.
Thank you.
The leaders of Israel have never considered from the very beginning that their country was big enough for them. They wanted a bigger country. The U.S., I don't think the U.S. leaders care that much about how much land Israel has. What they're worried about is managing a worldwide empire.